The exhaustion was a physical entity. It lived in the marrow of Alara Vance's bones, a cold and heavy tenant that had long since stopped paying rent. It was the quiet residue of a 12-hour shift that had stretched into 14, a brutal marathon of chest compressions, frantic intubations, and the thin, reedy sound of a mother weeping for a son who had arrived too late. The emergency room of St. Jude's Metropolitan was a perpetual storm, and Alara was one of its primary lighthouses, steady, unwavering, and slowly being eroded by the sea. She moved through the controlled chaos with a grace that belied the fatigue pulling at the corners of her eyes. Her hands, when she cleaned and packed away a suture kit, were economical and precise. No wasted motion. It was a skill honed over a decade of patching up the city's tragedies, one stitch at a time. She was charting, the blue-white light of the monitor painting her face in sterile hues, when she felt his presence before she saw him. It was a change in the air pressure, a cloying sweetness of expensive cologne attempting to mask the antiseptic smell of the ward. Dr. Marcus Thorne. He did not walk. He glided, a shark in tailored scrubs, his smile a bright, predatory thing that never reached his eyes. He was the hospital's golden boy, a cardiothoracic surgeon with a god complex and a portfolio of press clippings that painted him as a miracle worker. He leaned against the nurse's station, his posture a study in performed relaxation. "Vance," he said, his voice a low purr that always made the fine hairs on her arms stand on end. "Tidying up? You missed the main event. Councilman Davies came in with a classic widowmaker. I had him on the table in 7 minutes. Textbooks will be written." She did not look up from the screen. "I was here, Dr. Thorne. I was the one who diagnosed the STEMI and pushed the thrombolytics before he coded." She kept her tone flat, a smooth gray stone of fact. She did not add that she was the one who had run compressions for 9 minutes, cracking 2 of the councilman's ribs, but shocking his heart back into a viable rhythm, all while Thorne had been stuck in traffic after a leisurely lunch. His smile tightened by a barely perceptible fraction. He was working from a version of her that had never been accurate, a file he had not updated. He saw a competent but pliable nurse, a background player in the grand drama of his career. He did not see the woman who managed the entire ER floor during a multi-car pileup last Christmas, the woman who could triage 50 panicked patients with the calm of a chess master, the woman who had quietly rewritten 3 of the hospital's core emergency protocols for which he had publicly taken the credit. "Team effort," he said, the words a dismissive pat on the head. "But someone has to make the clutch play. Someone has to be the quarterback." He moved closer, his cologne a suffocating cloud. "Speaking of which, the fundraising committee for the Obsidian Heart Gala loved my proposal. The one we discussed." Ilara's fingers paused on the keyboard. The one we discussed was a generous term for the 30-page document she had researched and written on improving community health outreach, which he had glanced at for 5 minutes before submitting it under his own name. "I'm glad it was well received," she said, the words tasting like ash. "They want to move forward. It's a huge win for the hospital. For me." He let that hang in the air. "There's a dinner with the board tomorrow night to celebrate. I'll need you there, on my arm. It's a good look." It was not a question. This was the precipice. She had been living on it for years, a slow, grinding erosion of her work, her peace, her very self. The exhaustion that lived in her bones suddenly coalesced into a single, cold point of clarity. She thought about the weeping mother from earlier. She thought about the cracked ribs under her hands, the desperate, brutal work of saving a life. She thought about the hollow feeling of seeing her words, her ideas, her labor, presented on a slideshow with Marcus Thorne's smiling face next to them. She finally looked up, her gaze direct. "No," she said. The word was not loud, but it was solid. It had weight. Thorne blinked. It was a momentary glitch in his perfect system. The file was corrupted. "I'm sorry?" "No," she repeated, her voice steady as iron wrapped in silk. "I will not be attending the dinner, and I would appreciate it if you would stop submitting my work as your own." The air did not just change. It cracked. The performed relaxation fell away from him like a dropped mask. His face, stripped of its charming veneer, was ugly. A pinched, entitled fury twisted his features. "You have an obligation," he hissed, his voice losing its purr and gaining a venomous edge. "You are a nurse at this hospital. My hospital. You have an obligation to its betterment. To me." "My obligation is to the patients," she said, standing up. She was not as tall as him, but at that moment she felt taller. "I'm finished with my shift." She turned to walk away, a simple act of departure that he seemed to register as a declaration of war. He moved with a startling quickness, his hand clamping around her upper arm like a vice. "You don't walk away from me," he snarled, his fingers digging into her flesh. The fabric of her scrubs was thin, and the heat of his rage transferred directly to her skin. The corridor, previously a transient space of quiet efficiency, suddenly felt like a cage. A few junior nurses and an orderly froze at the far end, their eyes wide. They were mice witnessing a confrontation between cats, terrified and useless. Ilara did not scream. She did not struggle. All the frantic energy of the ER, all the chaos she expertly managed, seemed to reverse its polarity and flow into her, creating a zone of absolute, defiant stillness. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a trapped bird, but her face was a calm, cold mask. "Let go of my arm, Dr. Thorne," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. He laughed, a short, ugly bark. "Or what? You'll file a complaint? I sit on the review board. I am the board. You are nothing." His grip tightened, pulling her closer. His face was inches from hers, his breath hot and sour. "You are an asset, my asset, and you will learn to do as you are told." The hand connected with her cheek. It was not a slap. It was an open-palmed strike, hard and deliberate, meant to humiliate, to shock, to break. The sound of it was obscene in the quiet hallway, a wet, percussive crack that echoed off the polished linoleum. Ilara's head snapped to the side, her hair flying across her face. A constellation of white-hot stars exploded behind her eyes. The pain was sharp, immediate, but the shock was colder, deeper. The world narrowed to the brutal pressure of his fingers on her arm and the stinging, radiating heat on her cheek. She did not scream. A different sound cut through the ringing in her ears. It was not a loud sound. It was the soft, deliberate clink of a heavy glass being set down on a marble-topped table that wasn't there. It was the sound of a voice, low and devoid of inflection, that seemed to absorb all other noise in the hallway. "Let go of her arm." The voice came from the entrance to the private wing, a space usually reserved for the city's elite and their discreet ailments. A man stood there, half hidden in the alcove's shadow. He was not there a moment ago. Or perhaps he had been there all along, a piece of the architecture that had just decided to become animated. He was impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit that seemed to drink the fluorescent light. His stillness was absolute, the kind of stillness that is not an absence of motion, but a containment of immense, coiled potential. Thorne, startled, turned his head. He was still holding Ilara's arm, a flag of his possessive rage. He squinted into the dimness, his arrogance momentarily confused. "This is a private conversation," he snapped, dismissing the stranger as an irrelevance. "Hospital staff only." The man took a single step out of the shadow and into the full, unforgiving light of the corridor. Now Ilara could see him clearly. He was of average height, with sharp, intelligent features and dark hair cut with severe precision. But it was his eyes that held the room captive. They were dark, patient, and ancient. They were the eyes of a predator that has never known hunger, that hunts not for need, but for order. He looked at Thorne's hand on Ilara's arm, and a subtle, dangerous shift occurred in the air. The temperature in the hallway seemed to drop several degrees. He did not rush. He was not performing. He simply looked, and in that look, the entire power dynamic of the room was rewritten. Thorne's blustering confidence began to fray at the edges. The junior nurses and the orderly, who had been frozen in fear of the surgeon, were now frozen in awe of the stranger. I will not repeat myself, the man said. His voice was steady as a surgeon's scalpel and just as sharp. It was not a threat. It was a statement of impending fact. Thorne, high on his own adrenaline and outrage, made his final fatal miscalculation. He let out a condescending scoff. "And who the hell are you?" he demanded. "Her new boyfriend?" "Security." The man in the suit, Jin Huan Quan, gave a nearly imperceptible nod, a gesture not directed at Thorne but past him. From the stairwell door behind Thorne and from the elevator that chimed softly as it opened, two other men appeared. They wore the same dark, impeccably tailored suits. They moved without wasted motion, their footsteps silent on the polished floor. They were not hospital security. Hospital security were paunchy, bored men in ill-fitting uniforms. These men were lean, alert, and carried with them the kind of silence that doesn't echo, the kind that settles. One of them, an older man with silvering temples and a face like a carved stone, whom Alara would later know as Mr. Kang, stepped up to Thorne. He did not touch him. He simply stood beside him, his presence an absolute negation of Thorne's authority. "Dr. Marcus Thorne, Mr." Kang said, his voice a quiet murmur. "You will release the woman, then you will come with us." Thorne's face, which had cycled from rage to confusion, now landed on a new expression, a dawning, sickly fear. He seemed to finally register the quality of the suits, the unnerving calm of the men, the absolute authority radiating from the man in the charcoal suit. He was a shark who had just realized he was swimming in a tank with a great white. His fingers, which had been a vice on Alara's arm, suddenly went slack. He let go as if her skin had become superheated. "There's been a misunderstanding," Thorne stammered, his voice losing all its bluster, becoming thin and reedy. Jin Huan Quan's gaze did not waver from Thorne. "There has been no misunderstanding," he said, his voice a flat line. "You have been understood perfectly." He gave another small nod to his men. Mr. Kang and the other man flanked Thorne. There was no struggle. There was no shouting. They each placed a hand on his arms, and the celebrated surgeon, the god of St. Jude's, became pliant as a child's doll. They guided him away, not toward the main exit, but toward the service elevator at the end of the hall. It was a removal, clinical and efficient. As they walked away, Thorne's head was down, his arrogant posture collapsed into a defeated slump. He did not look back. He was an error being deleted from the system. The hallway was now profoundly silent. The junior nurses and the orderly seemed to have vanished, melting back into the woodwork of the hospital. It was just Alara and the man in the charcoal suit. The stinging on her cheek was a dull, throbbing ache now. She felt strangely lightheaded, the adrenaline of the confrontation giving way to a deep, trembling shock. The man, Jin, walked toward her. He stopped a respectful distance away. His eyes, which had been so cold and hard when focused on Thorne, softened almost imperceptibly as they met hers. He looked at the red mark blooming on her cheek, a faint handprint of violence. His jaw tightened for a fraction of a second, the only sign of the fury he kept so tightly leashed. He held out a hand. In it was a handkerchief of pristine white linen, folded into a perfect square. "You're safe," he said. The words were simple, yet they landed with the force of a physical shield. "He will not bother you again." Alara stared at the handkerchief, then at his face. There was something about his voice, a low, resonant timbre beneath the calm surface. A flicker of something ancient and half-forgotten stirred in her memory. She took the handkerchief. The linen was cool and smooth against her trembling fingers. She pressed it gently to her cheek, the fabric a small anchor in the swirling sea of her shock. "Thank you," she whispered, the words feeling inadequate. "Mr. Kang will see to your belongings," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "I'm taking you home." It was not her home they went to. Her home was a small third-floor apartment that always smelled faintly of her downstairs neighbor's cooking and was filled with medical textbooks and the quiet loneliness of a life lived on the periphery of other people's emergencies. The car that waited for them at the hospital's private rear exit was a black sedan with windows so dark they seemed to swallow the light. The door was opened for her by a silent driver, and she slid onto the cool leather of the back seat. Jin got in beside her, and the door closed with a solid, satisfying thud, sealing them in a capsule of profound silence and the scent of leather and his subtle, clean cologne, nothing like Thorne's oppressive sweetness. The car moved off into the night, a silent predator navigating the city's concrete canyons. Ilara stared out the window, watching the familiar landscape of her life slide by like a movie she was no longer a part of. The shock was beginning to recede, replaced by 1,000 frantic questions. Who was this man? Why had he been at the hospital? How did he command such immediate, terrifying obedience? She was a nurse. She solved problems. She assessed situations and formulated plans. Right now, she had no data. She was operating blind, a feeling she despised. He did not press her. He sat beside her in the darkness, a bastion of stillness. He seemed to understand that she needed the silence, that her mind was a whirlwind and words would only be more debris. He let her process, his patience a tangible thing in the enclosed space. Finally, as the car crossed a bridge, the city lights glittering on the dark water below, she turned to him. "Who are you?" He looked at her, his expression unreadable in the intermittent glow of the streetlights. "My name is Jin Huan Quan." He said it as if it should mean something to her. It didn't. "And we have met before." Ilara searched his face, trying to place him. His features were distinctive, yet she was sure she had never seen him. Her life was the hospital and her apartment. She didn't move in circles where men in suits like his existed. "I'm sorry," she said. "I don't remember." A faint ghost of a smile touched his lips. It was not a smile of amusement, but of something else. Recognition. "You wouldn't? It was 5 years ago. You were a student. An Italian restaurant downtown. Il Corvo." The name was a key, unlocking a room in her memory she had long since sealed shut. Il Corvo. Red checkered tablecloths, the smell of garlic and oregano, a date with a fellow student, a boy whose name she no longer remembered, and then chaos. The memory returned not as a linear story but as a series of violent sensory snapshots, the shattering of the plate glass window, the sound of gunfire so much louder and more concussive than in the movies, the screams, the instinctual animal panic that had seized the entire restaurant, sending people diving under tables, scrambling for the kitchens, a wave of pure terror. She had frozen, her fork halfway to her mouth, the world dissolving into noise and fear. Her date had grabbed her arm, shouting her name, trying to pull her under the table, but she couldn't move. She was paralyzed. Across the room, a man at a large corner table had slumped forward, a dark flower blooming on the white of his shirt, and in that moment her paralysis had broken, but she had not run. She had not hidden. The years of training, the instinct to heal, had overridden the instinct to flee. She had pulled away from her date, walked on unsteady legs through the surreal landscape of overturned chairs and shattered glass, and knelt beside the wounded man. She remembered pressing her hands to his side, the linen napkin she grabbed from the table quickly turning a slick, horrifying crimson. She remembered shouting instructions at a terrified waiter to find a belt, to call for help, her voice a strange island of clinical calm in the ocean of panic. She remembered looking up and her eyes meeting another's across the room, a young man seated at the head of the now devastated corner table. He had not dived for cover. He was surrounded by men who had drawn their own weapons, returning fire, but he himself sat in the eye of the hurricane, perfectly still. He was watching her. His face was a mask of cold fury directed at the attackers, but his eyes, when they met hers, held something else, a flicker of disbelief, of appraisal. He was watching her, the one person in the entire restaurant who was not running, who was not hiding, who had moved toward the violence not to fight, but to mend. "That was you," she whispered, the realization dawning. The young man from the restaurant. Older now, the last vestiges of youth burned away and replaced with an unshakable authority. But it was him. That was me, Jin confirmed, his voice low. The man you helped was my uncle. He lived. The doctors said the pressure you applied, the makeshift tourniquet you directed the waiter to tie, it gave them the extra minutes they needed. The car turned off the main road, passing through a high, unmarked gate that swung open silently to receive them. They were on a private drive winding up a hill. "I never forgot your face," he continued, his gaze steady on her. "In a room full of people running from danger, you were the only one who walked toward it to help. It was illogical. It was remarkable." He said the word remarkable as if it were a rare diagnosis he had finally been able to confirm. "I had my people find out who you were. I've been aware of you ever since." The car came to a stop before a house that was less a house and more a work of modern art, all glass and steel and clean lines, perched on the hillside with a panoramic view of the city lights spread out like a carpet of fallen stars. "Aware of me?" Ilara's voice was tight with a new kind of shock. This was not a rescue. This was something else entirely. "You've been watching me? I ensure the people who prove themselves valuable are looked after," he said, his choice of words deliberate and precise. "My organization thrives on competence and loyalty. You displayed a rare form of the first, under extreme duress. I made sure your path through your career was clear of unnecessary obstacles. A scholarship fund that appeared just when you needed it. A residency slot that opened up unexpectedly at St. Jude's." Ilara felt a wave of vertigo. Her life, which she had thought was a product of her own hard work, her own relentless struggle, had been quietly curated by a man she hadn't known existed. The anger she had felt at Thorne was a simple, hot thing. This was a more complex emotion, a confusing mix of violation and a strange, disorienting gratitude. "When my sources informed me of Dr. Thorne's behavior," Jin went on, his voice hardening again, "of his habit of taking credit for your work and his escalating harassment, I began the process of acquiring the necessary leverage to remove him. My mother is on the board of a foundation that contributes heavily to St. Jude's. His actions were becoming a liability to my family's philanthropic interests. Tonight simply accelerated the timeline." The driver opened her door. The night air was cool and clean, a stark contrast to the stale, recycled air of the hospital. "You will not return to that hospital," Jin said. It was not a suggestion. It was a statement of fact, as absolute as the law of gravity. "You will stay here. You are safe now." He got out of the car and stood beside her, a silent, unmovable guardian against the backdrop of his kingdom. She looked from his implacable face to the sprawling, glittering city below. She had left her small third-floor life behind. She had been brought to the mountaintop, and she had no idea if she was a guest or a prisoner. The days that followed were a study in disorientation. The place, a sprawling penthouse that occupied the top 2 floors of a residential skyscraper Jin's company owned, was less a home and more a fortress of quiet luxury. The windows were vast sheets of glass that framed the city like a living painting. The silence was the most profound change. It was a deep, textural silence, broken only by the distant hum of the city and the whisper of the climate control system. After years in the constant, clamorous environment of the ER, the quiet felt both like a balm and a sensory deprivation tank. Mr. Kang, the stone-faced man from the hospital, became her primary point of contact. He appeared each morning with a tablet device. "Miss Vance," he would say, his voice a respectful baritone, "Mr. Kwan has arranged for a selection of clothing to be delivered. Please indicate your preferences. Mr. Kwan has also secured your personal effects from your apartment. They are in the 2nd bedroom. A chef is on call. Please let me know your dietary requirements." He handled everything with the frictionless efficiency of a man who had managed empires from the shadows. Ilara found herself grappling with a profound internal conflict. One part of her, the part that had been running on fumes for a decade, reveled in the peace. It was an unspeakable relief to wake up without the shrill alarm, without the dread of another confrontation with Thorne, without the bone-deep weariness. But another, more stubborn part of her chafed against the gilded bars of this cage. She was a person of action, of competence. To be handled, however gently, felt like a diminishment. She was grateful for the protection, but she was terrified of the dependency it implied. On the third day, she found her voice. When Mr. Kang arrived with his morning briefing, she met him by the vast window overlooking the city. "Mr. Kang," she said, her tone polite but firm, "I am not a doll to be dressed and fed. I am a nurse. I need to work." Mr. Kang did not seem surprised. He simply nodded. "Mr. Kwan anticipated this. He has a proposal for you." He handed her the tablet. On the screen was a detailed file, a preliminary audit of the Kwan conglomerate's corporate health and safety protocols. It was a mess of outdated procedures, conflicting directives, and glaring gaps in emergency preparedness for a global organization with tens of thousands of employees. "Mr. Kwan believes the entire system requires a complete overhaul, Mr. Kang explained. He requires an architect for the new system, someone with practical, high-stress field experience and a mind for systemic efficiency. He believes you are the only person for the job." It was a masterstroke. It was not a token project. It was a monumental task, a complex, multifaceted problem that would require all of her intelligence, her experience, her meticulous attention to detail. It was a job, a real one, that acknowledged her skills and gave her agency. It was an offer of a different kind of power. She looked from the tablet to Mr. Kang's impassive face. "I'll need an office," she said. Her first meeting with Jin since that night was in the sprawling, minimalist study on the upper floor. He was standing by the window, a dark silhouette against the setting sun. He was on the phone, his voice too low to be heard, but the cadence was calm, authoritative. He finished his call, turned, and gave her his full attention. "The project is acceptable?" he asked. "It's a disaster," she replied bluntly. "Your emergency response plans look like they were written in 1995. You have offices in seismically active zones with no earthquake protocols. Your executive medical kits are filled with expired aspirin and Band-Aids. If a senior manager has a heart attack in your Tokyo office, they're dead." For the first time, she saw a genuine, unguarded emotion on his face. "Respect. That is why you are here," he said, "to fix it." And so began their strange, quiet courtship, conducted over blueprints and risk assessment charts. They fell into a rhythm. She would work all day in her new, fully equipped office, diving into the complex logistics of his empire. In the evenings, they would share a meal, often in silence, on the terrace overlooking the city. The silence was no longer awkward, it was comfortable, a shared space where neither had to perform. Sometimes they would talk. She would ask about a subsidiary in Seoul, and he would explain the intricate politics of the shipping industry. He would ask about triage theory, and she would explain the brutal, beautiful logic of saving the most people possible, not just the first. It was a slow, careful unpeeling of layers. He was not just a powerful man. He was a brilliant systems architect, managing a global web of interests with the same unhurried precision she applied to a trauma patient. She was not just a nurse. She was a strategist, a logician with a deep, empathetic understanding of human frailty. They were two sides of the same coin, one building an empire of power, the other an empire of care. One evening, an elderly woman with the same sharp, intelligent eyes as Jin appeared at the penthouse, escorted by Mr. Kang. She was dressed in a traditional hanbok of deep indigo silk, her posture as straight and unyielding as a steel rod. This was his mother, Mrs. Kwan, the matriarch of the family. She dismissed her son with a wave of her hand and sat opposite Alara, studying her with an intensity that was far more intimidating than any of Jin's silent appraisals. She had been a ghost in the story, a name on a foundation board. Now she was here, a formidable presence. Mrs. Kwan poured them both tea, her movements small and precise. "My son has never brought a woman here," she said, her English perfect and clipped. "He collects people of talent, of loyalty, but he keeps them at a distance. You are not at a distance. Ilara met her gaze. I'm not sure what I am, Mrs. Kwan. You are the woman who did not run, the old woman stated, as if it were a title. He told me the story. He has told it many times. He sees the world as a system of assets and threats. It is a lonely way to live. You see the world as a system of wounds to be mended. She took a sip of her tea, her eyes sharp over the rim of the cup. He has torn down a man for you. Now he is letting you rebuild a piece of his world. This is new. She paused. You have good eyes. You see things as they are. My son needs someone who sees things as they are. It was not an interrogation. It was a pronouncement, an acceptance. While Ilara was building her new world, Jin was quietly, methodically dismantling Marcus Thorne's old one. It was not a vengeful rage. It was a cold, passionless process, like fumigating a house. He did not act directly. He acted through proxies, through holding companies, through leveraging debt. He acquired the small private imaging clinic where Thorne was a minority partner. He bought the outstanding debt of the medical device company Thorne had endorsed for a hefty, undeclared fee. He had Mr. Kang's team compile a meticulous file, a thick and damning document detailing every corner cut, every protocol ignored, every nurse harassed, every lie told. He was not just removing a threat. He was erasing a flawed component from the system. He was cleaning the wound. Marcus Thorne lived in a state of weaponized delusion. After his humiliating removal from the hospital, he had been released a few hours later in a deserted parking garage with a quiet warning from Mr. Kang to stay away from Ilara Vance. The warning, in his mind, was a negotiation tactic. The men in suits were thugs, hired muscle for Ilara's new, brutish benefactor. Thorne was a man of medicine and law, a pillar of the community. He had connections. He had status. This gangster, whoever he was, had miscalculated. He thinks he can intimidate me, Thorne fumed to his lawyer, a slick man named Peterson who was already regretting taking the case. They sat in Thorne's ostentatious home office, surrounded by plaques and awards that now seemed like relics from another lifetime. He doesn't understand who I am. He had been forced to resign from St. Jude's, a move couched in vague language about pursuing new opportunities. But the humiliation burned under his skin. He saw Ilara not as a person who had left him, but as a prize that had been stolen. His arrogance was a fortress, impenetrable to reality. He believed she was a victim, brainwashed or intimidated. He believed she would soon tire of her gilded cage and come crawling back to the world where she belonged, under his authority. Give her 3 days, he had initially told himself. Then a week, then 2. His calls to her phone went to a disconnected number. His increasingly frantic emails went unanswered. The silence from her end was not interpreted as a final decision, but as proof of her captivity. We file a lawsuit, Thorne declared, slamming his hand on his mahogany desk. Against her for breach of contract. She had professional obligations. Against this Kwan person for kidnapping, for undue influence, and against the hospital for wrongful termination. We'll bleed them dry in discovery. We'll expose this thug for what he is. Peterson, his lawyer, shifted uncomfortably. He had done a preliminary search on Jin Huan Kwan. The results were sparse, corporate, and deeply unsettling. Chairman of a global logistics and investment firm, board member of a dozen other entities. A ghost in the media with only a few formal, high-resolution photos available. There were whispers on certain financial forums, rumors of a corporate raider who moved with the speed and lethality of a shark, but nothing concrete, nothing illegal. Just a deep, unnerving sense of immense, quiet power. Marcus, Peterson said carefully. A lawsuit against a man like Kwan might be inadvisable. He is not a street criminal. He is in a different league. The kind of league where they don't have lawyers, they have law firms, on retainer. Thorne waved a dismissive hand. He's overplayed his hand. He's arrogant. I'll expose him. The Obsidian Heart Gala is in 2 weeks. It's the biggest event in the city's medical community. He'll be there flaunting her like a trophy. I'll confront them, publicly, in front of everyone, in front of the board members who forced me out. I'll give her a chance to come to her senses, to leave him. When she does, his whole facade will crumble. He was working from a version of Alara that was years out of date, a version that had perhaps never existed at all. He saw her as timid, dependent, an accessory. He could not conceive of her as an agent of her own destiny, a woman who had made a choice. His narcissism was a blindfold, and he was walking confidently toward the edge of a cliff, convinced it was a stage. The escalation was his final desperate move. He instructed Peterson to file the lawsuits, a flurry of paper designed to create noise and chaos. He leaked a sanitized version of the story to a friendly gossip columnist, a respected surgeon, a troubled nurse, a mysterious and controlling new figure in her life. It was a narrative designed to paint him as the hero, the rescuer. The trap was set, but it was not his trap. Jin was aware of every move Thorne made before he made it. The filing of the lawsuit was reported to him by Mr. Kang within minutes. The gossip column piece was flagged by his media monitoring team. Jin read the article on his tablet, his expression unchanged. He did not get angry. He simply processed the new data. Thorne's actions were not a threat. They were a gift. They were a public invitation to a public execution. He will be at the gala, mister, Kang stated. I know, Jin replied, setting the tablet aside. He looked across the study at Alara, who was sketching a new workflow diagram on a whiteboard, her brow furrowed in concentration. She was completely absorbed, building something new and better. She was already in the future. Thorne was a ghost, haunting a past she had already left behind. Ensure the final acquisitions are completed by then, Jin said quietly, and have the full dossier prepared for distribution, digital and physical copies. It is already done, sir, Mr. Kang replied. Jin nodded. The trap was not being set. It had been set for weeks. Marcus Thorne was not walking into it. He had been living inside it all along. The gala would simply be the moment the door swung shut. The Obsidian Heart Gala was the glittering apex of the city's philanthropic society, $1,000-a-plate affair held in the grand ballroom of the city's most historic hotel. It was a sea of black ties, sequined gowns, and the carefully maintained smiles of the city's elite. The air hummed with polite conversation and the clinking of champagne flutes, a symphony of power and influence. Alara stood beside Jin near the sweeping marble staircase, a statue of calm in the swirling social eddy. She wore an emerald green gown, a simple architectural sheath of silk that fell to the floor. It was a color Jin had chosen, saying it matched the fire and intelligence in her eyes. For the first time in her life, she felt not like an overlooked nurse or a victim, but like a queen. The feeling was foreign, unnerving, but not unwelcome. Jin's hand rested lightly on the small of her back, a point of warmth and unshakable stability. He wore a dark blue suit, tailored to perfection, a quiet void of stillness in the glittering chaos. Then she saw him. Marcus Thorne. He stood near the entrance, a discordant note in the room's careful harmony. His tuxedo was impeccable, but he wore it like a costume. There was a desperate, hungry look in his eyes as he scanned the crowd. His practiced swagger was still there, but it was brittle now, a thin veneer over a core of raw panic. He spotted them, and a grim, triumphant smile spread across his face. He began to move toward them, a heat-seeking missile locked on its target. He's coming, Alara said, her voice a low murmur. Her heart gave a single hard thump against her ribs. I know, Jin replied, his hand never leaving her back. Breathe. You are perfectly safe. Thorne cut a path through the crowd, his movements too aggressive for the setting. He came to a stop before them, positioning himself so that several prominent hospital board members and the city's mayor were within earshot. It was a calculated, theatrical move. Alara, he said, his voice loud enough to turn heads. He ignored Jin completely, focusing on her with a look of feigned, paternal concern. Thank God, I've been so worried. You don't have to do this. You can leave with me right now. A small circle of silence began to form around them as conversations nearby faltered. The music from the string quartet seemed to dim. Ilara looked at him. The man who had terrorized her, belittled her, and struck her. He seemed smaller now, his power a cheap, theatrical prop under the grand chandeliers of the ballroom. There was no fear left in her, only a kind of weary pity. "There seems to be a misunderstanding, Marcus," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I am exactly where I want to be." Thorne's face flushed a blotchy red. This was not in his script. "He has you confused, Ilara. This is not you. You have an obligation to your career, to the hospital. You owe me." He took a step closer, his voice rising with righteous indignation. "Sign the papers, Ilara, the ones my lawyer sent. End this farce." Jin had been silent, a statue of patient observation. Now he spoke. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the room like a shard of ice. "Sit down, Marcus." Thorne finally turned to him, his face contorted in a sneer. "You have no authority here. This is a private matter between me and my colleague." "No," Jin said, his voice dropping even lower, becoming more dangerous. "It is a business matter, and I have all the authority." He turned his head slightly, his gaze falling on Mr. Henderson, the chairman of the St. Jude's Hospital Board, who was watching the scene unfold with a look of horror. "Mr. Henderson," Jin said, his tone polite, almost conversational, "I believe your hospital has been having some financial difficulties lately. A significant amount of outstanding debt, some poorly structured loans." Henderson paled. "That is confidential board information, Mr. Kwan." "Not when I am the one who holds the debt," Jin replied smoothly. "As of last Tuesday, my firm acquired the controlling interest in the financial consortium that holds St. Jude's primary mortgage and operational credit lines. I found some inefficiencies in the hospital's financial structure, so I corrected them. You work for me now." A collective gasp went through the assembled onlookers. Henderson looked as if he might faint. Jin then turned his cool, analytical gaze back to Thorne. "You mentioned a lawsuit, Dr. Thorne, filed by your legal counsel, the firm of Peterson, Finch, and Avery." He lifted his phone, the screen glowing. "This is a copy of the notice of dissolution for that firm. I acquired their partner's collective private debt 3 days ago. A rather unfortunate series of margin calls. As of this morning, they no longer have a practice. They certainly will not be representing you." Thorne's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The color drained from his face, leaving it a waxy, sickly yellow. The brittle swagger shattered, and for the first time, pure, unadulterated terror dawned in his eyes. Jin was not finished. He was not angry. He was simply closing out a file. "Your private surgical practice," he continued, his voice a calm, devastating litany. "The lease on that building on Park Avenue is held by a real estate subsidiary that my company acquired last month. Your lease will not be renewed. The equipment, I'm afraid, was collateral on a loan you defaulted on this afternoon. It will be seized tomorrow." He took a small, deliberate step closer to the trembling surgeon. "Your investment portfolio has been liquidated to cover the penalties for the financial misconduct my forensic accountants uncovered. Insider trading on that medical device company. A rather clumsy attempt. And finally, your reputation." Jin gestured to Mr. Kang, who stepped forward and handed a slim, elegant folder to the chairman of the State Medical Board, who was standing beside the mayor. "That," Jin said, "is a full dossier of your professional indiscretions. It includes sworn and notarized testimony from 17 nurses you have harassed over the last decade. It includes evidence of your fraudulent appropriation of others' research, including Miss Vance's. It includes proof of 2 cases of fatal malpractice you covered up. Copies have already been delivered to the district attorney's office and to several prominent journalists who are very dear friends of mine. Your name will be a synonym for disgrace by morning." It was total. It was absolute. It was ruin, delivered in a calm, measured monologue in the middle of a black-tie gala. Marcus Thorne made a small choking sound. His entire world, the edifice of arrogance and lies he had built his life upon, had been dismantled and demolished in the space of 90 seconds. The plaques on his wall, the respect he commanded, the money in his accounts, it was all an illusion, and the magician had just revealed the trick. His knees gave out. He dropped to the polished marble floor with a heavy, undignified thud. He was no longer a surgeon, a power player, a man of status. He was just a broken, terrified man on his knees. He began to sob, great, racking, ugly sounds that filled the profound silence of the ballroom. Two of the hotel's security guards, looking profoundly uncomfortable, moved forward and gently, firmly, lifted the weeping man to his feet. They dragged him away, his expensive shoes scuffing on the floor. And then he was gone. The silence that followed was a physical presence. It was the sound of 100 wealthy, powerful people realizing they had just witnessed a public execution of a man's entire existence. Jin turned away from the spectacle as if erasing an error on a spreadsheet, his focus returning to the room. His gaze was calm, his expression unchanged. He looked back at the stunned hospital chairman, Mr. Henderson. "Now that the distraction is dealt with," Jin said, his voice returning to its normal, quiet tone, "we can address more important matters." He placed his hand on Alara's arm, not just a supportive gesture, but a presentation, a coronation. "I believe there was some confusion in the media about the protocol used in the successful resuscitation of Councilman Davies last month," Jin announced to the silent, captive audience. The credit was mistakenly attributed to Dr. Thorne, who, as I recall, was late. His eyes swept the room, daring anyone to disagree. "I would like to introduce you all to Alara Vance." He paused, letting her name hang in the air, gathering weight and importance. "She was the senior nurse on duty that day. She is the architect of that save, the one whose quick thinking and flawless execution made the difference between life and death. For the past several weeks, she has been the architect of a complete overhaul of my own corporation's global health and safety infrastructure. She has been the most capable person in every room she has been in for years. It is merely that no one with the power to see it took the time to look." He looked directly at Henderson, his voice leaving no room for negotiation. "As of next month, Miss Vance will be overseeing the complete operational restructuring of St. Jude's emergency services. She will have full authority and an unlimited budget. She will be reporting directly to me." He had not just saved her. He had not just protected her. He had seen her, truly and completely, and now he was making the entire world see her too. He was taking the quiet, immense competence she held within her and giving it a name, a title, a kingdom to command. Alara looked out at the sea of stunned, staring faces, the doctors who had ignored her, the administrators who had patronized her, the board members who had never known her name. She did not feel triumphant. She did not feel vengeful. She felt correct, placed, as if a bone, dislocated for a decade, had finally been set back into its proper socket. She gave a single, small, regal nod, an acceptance of her new reality. Later that night, the gala was a distant, glittering memory. They stood on the terrace of the penthouse, the cool night air a welcome balm. Below them, the city was a vast, silent tapestry of light and shadow. The adrenaline of the evening had finally faded, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep peace. Alara leaned against the railing, took a deep breath, and then let it out in a slow, shuddering sigh. It was the exhale she had been holding for 5 years, for 10, for a lifetime. A genuine smile, the first she could remember in a long time, touched her lips. It was not a performance. It was not a defense. It was real, and it reached all the way to her eyes. Jin stood beside her, not touching, but his presence was a solid warmth in the darkness. He was watching her, his expression soft in the reflected glow of the city. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I am," she said, and she was surprised by the simple truth of it. The weight was gone. The constant, grinding exhaustion, the fear, the anger, it had all been cauterized in the fire of Thorne's public ruin. All that was left was a clean, quiet stillness. "Thank you," she said, turning to face him, "not just for tonight, for seeing me." "Seeing you was the only logical response," he replied, his voice a low rumble. Competence should be recognized, brilliance should be utilized. It is inefficient to do otherwise. She laughed, a soft, real sound. You make it sound like a business transaction. To me, he said, his gaze intense. There is no higher compliment. Mr. Kang appeared at the doorway to the terrace, holding a sleek leather portfolio. He approached and bowed his head slightly. Miss Vance, your official appointment papers from the Board of St. Jude's, and your new credentials. Everything has been countersigned and finalized. He presented the portfolio to her. Ilara took it. The leather was cool and smooth under her fingers. She opened it. Inside, on heavy cream-colored paper, was her new title, Executive Director of Emergency Services and Systemic Reform. Below it was an employment contract with a salary that made her head spin and a set of security cards that would give her access to every part of the hospital she had once served in obscurity. It was real. Thank you, Mr. Kang, she said, her voice thick with emotion. It is an honor, Director Vance, he replied, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of genuine warmth in the man's stony eyes. He gave a respectful nod to both of them and then retreated, melting back into the shadows of the penthouse. Ilara looked at Jin, the portfolio in her hands a tangible symbol of her vindication. I don't leave because things become complicated, she said, repeating the words she had spoken to him during one of their late-night work sessions when she had been explaining why she stayed in the ER for so long. It had been her creed, her reason for enduring. He stepped closer, finally closing the small space between them. He gently took her free hand, his fingers lacing with hers. It was not a gesture of sweeping passion, but of quiet, profound partnership, a joining of two equal forces. Neither do I, he said, his thumb stroking the back of her hand. This is not the end, Ilara. This is the beginning. We have a hospital to rebuild. She looked down at their joined hands, then up at his face. She saw her future there, not a simple happily ever after, but something far more real and infinitely more satisfying, a future of challenges, of hard work, of building things that mattered, a future of quiet evenings, of shared understanding, of a partnership forged in fire and built on a foundation of mutual respect. A family built not from obligation or convenience, but from the daily, deliberate choice to stay, to see, and to build together. They stood there for a long time, two quiet sovereigns on their mountaintop, looking out at the city that was now, in a very real way, theirs to mend. The story was not over. It had just begun.